Good afternoon. I am Pamela Casey, District Attorney for the 41st Judicial Circuit here in Blount County. It's a position I've held since 2011. Today we saw a rare event in Alabama, and that is the sentencing of an individual to life without the possibility of parole for the sexual abuse of a child. Under Alabama law, if a child is under the age of 6, and the individual is over the age of 21, and it is a rape first, sodomy first, or sexual torture of a child under the age of 6, that person's mandatory sentence must be life without the possibility of parole. Jeffrey Gable, who is 54 years of age, was sentenced this morning to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the horrendous things he did to a 3-year-old child here in Blount County. He was tried to a jury of his peers several weeks ago, and that jury returned guilty verdicts on both sexual torture and sex abuse. This morning he was sentenced to life imprisonment for the sexual torture, and he was also sentenced to 20 years for the sex abuse first. Both of those being mandatory, the 20 years being mandatory minimum on the sex abuse first. You know, sadly in the state of Alabama, the only sentence where we know what an individual will get is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Under our sentencing scheme and guidelines, many times we are unable to tell victims how long someone may actually serve when they are sentenced for child sex crimes. But today we can tell this family and this victim that her perpetrator will never be able to get out of prison. Currently, there is a pre-filed bill in the state of Alabama in the legislature that would increase the punishment for crimes, rape first and sodomy first, to be eligible for the death penalty if the child is under the age of 6. That's been pre-filed for the legislature, and that is a bill that will be taken up in the spring. Now, that would not have applied to this case because sexual torture is not included in that new list. We would like to see that, and we hope that the representative would consider that at some point. Now, previously the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that would be unconstitutional, but we believe that this state and other states are attempting to challenge that, so that anybody who inflicts horrendous crime of a child against a child, that they would be held accountable to the highest extent. One of the greatest accomplishments I feel like I have as a DA, but also one of the hardest things I do as a DA, is prosecute child sex offenders. The hardest thing is to see young children as young as 5 and 6 have to come into a courtroom and take the stand and testify against someone who commits horrific acts against them. We ask these young children to come in and sit on a stand and look at 12 men and women and tell them about the most horrific things that happened to them. People they never met before. Go into a big room they've never been in before. And recently in this county, we have been very successful, and we have been the whole time been DA, but just in the last 12 months, we've seen someone get 360 years for abusing a child, sexually abusing a child, 40 years, 50 years, 2 life sentences plus 30 years, 20 years, and today life without the possibility of parole. Child abuse and child sex abuse in this country is a pandemic, and we have to remind people that sometimes that in most of these cases I tell you about, I'm telling you about now, and even in this case, it's someone in the home with the child. It's someone they know, and it's usually someone they're related to. So today, I'm asking you, especially parents, to be aware of who is around your child and be aware of any unusual behaviors. Be aware if you have a child who's just not acting right and doesn't want to be around a particular family member. Those things should make you pause and ask yourself why. Why does she not want to see Pawpaw? Why does she not want to keep going to visit Dad? Because even in one of these cases, it was a biological father. At this time, I'll take any questions that anyone might have.
Can you just go over, just not specific, but just this particular case and kind of outline it for us?
Okay. So evidence presented at trial showed that the child in this case, the mother encountered her with an actual sex toy. after the defendant had left the bedroom. She had her underwear down, and we interviewed, law enforcement interviewed the victim at the Children's Center, in which she described events that that Paw had done to her.
I think it was mentioned in the courtroom earlier that the defense filed a motion for a new trial. State plans to respond to that. Hearing is set. What does the state plan include in its response to that motion?
Well, we'll wait to get the transcript, but we feel confident in our conviction and in the testimony elicited at trial, and it's a standard motion. Everyone's going to file a motion for a new trial outlining any reasons they have. We expect this in all cases, especially, and we want the court to review a case where life imprisonment without the possibility of parole has been the sentence. And so absolutely intend to respond to that and present evidence at the hearing.
Because the defense attorney is basing this on there was a lack of sufficient evidence to support a finding that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of sexual torture and abuse because there was no penetration. How do you plan to argue against that?
Well, almost every defendant argues there was not sufficient evidence at the conclusion of a case. 12 men and women from Blount County were impaneled in this case. And they listened to this young lady, I say young lady, she was 3, she was a baby, go into the Children's Center and talk about what had happened to her. She was able to identify the different types of objects, and law enforcement were able to locate those objects when they executed a search warrant on that home. We feel like there was more than sufficient evidence to support the verdict in this case, and we'll continue to argue that and stand up for this young victim.
Does sexual torture require the sentencing of life in prison without parole?
If the child is under the age of 6 and the defendant's over the age of 21.
What's the difference between, say, when you have a sexual torture, what takes it to the sexual torture level?
The use of an inanimate object on the sexual organs or mouth of another, of a child or a person, because you could sexually torture a person, but in this case the sentence came because of the age of the child and the age of the defendant, which we alleged in the indictment when we indicted Mr. Gable years ago.
When Gable was indicted about probably a little over 4 years ago, I mean, this has been probably a very strenuous, long process for the victim and their entire family. How are they doing, and has this provided any sense of relief? I know it doesn't change what happened, but just knowing that he is now behind bars for good.
You know, it's interesting, and we talked to our victims in cases similar to this, especially sex abuse victims, and we use a lot of words like closure. And there really is never closure for these victims, especially when they're young. We don't know what effect it's going to have on them as they get older. It's always a good day when you can put away a bad person for hurting a child. And so I think they're relieved to see that happen. It was sad for me in our office to have to watch this young little girl take the stand and testify in this case. So I believe the family is very relieved that he is not going to be on the streets. Even in homicide cases, when we talk to victims of that, there's this belief that, well, if we put, John Doe in prison for killing our daughter, we'll feel better. And they just don't feel better. And children still live with what was done to them. We have a lot of close relationships with some of our prior, and I like to call them a survivor, because that's what they are. They have survived some of the most horrific things that have happened to them, and they still stand to tell their story. Recently had a 16-year-old young lady whose stepfather was molesting her. And, we talked a lot with her after about, you are a survivor. You are not a victim to this, and do not let it dictate the rest of your life.
You read off a minute ago a lot of sentences that Blount County has given to people in the last 12 months regarding child abuse and child sexual abuse. You also mentioned, I believe you call it an epidemic across the country, but we are seeing a lot of prosecution here in Blount County. Is this something that the DA is really wanting to crack down on, and law enforcement in Blount County is really wanting to crack down on?
So I've been very serious about prosecuting child abuse perpetrators my whole career. We have an excellent law enforcement officer who investigates these cases with us as a partnership. And so we've had a change in judges in Blount County over the last 24 months. I think that's why we're seeing a little bit more of movement in the court system and harsher sentences. And so we will take all of our cases seriously. We're going to evaluate every case. We may not be able to try every case to a jury. You know, we may talk with our victim, and it's more important to our victim that someone admit that they did this crime to them than it is to see them actually put away in prison. And so we're always working with our victims in the cases to make sure that they are, you know, the best we can meet their needs, but also meet the needs of society. And society's needs are that we get these people off the streets and we don't have further victims or additional victims. Because I think you'll see that some of the people that we prosecuted that got these long sentences, this was not their first victim. Not necessarily that they had been previously prosecuted, but there have been prior allegations of sex abuse against those people.
Yeah, the 20 years was on sex abuse in the first degree. Can you differentiate how that crime differed from this sexual abuse?
Yeah, so sexual contact is going to be the sex abuse versus the actual penetration and or touching of the inanimate object. It's going to separate the two.
Well, what type of resources will be made available by the state for the victim for years to come?
So in Blount County and a majority of our counties in the state, we have child advocacy centers. And here in Blount County, we have the Blount County Children's Center, which will provide free counseling to any victims of abuse. And I want the public to know that that's something available even if there's not a prosecution. You can reach out to that facility, and each of the counties have a different name for their children's center. And even adult survivors have the ability to get counseling and group counseling sessions through that program at no cost to them.
Just kind of piggybacking on that, oftentimes, unfortunately, these types of crimes go unreported. To anyone who's watching this, you know, what's your message to them?
It's never too late to tell law enforcement about what happened to you. It may affect the strength of the case. We have, you know, the Bird case that I represented earlier in 20 years, that was years and years prior that happened, and then the victims came forward, okay? We will do our best to seek the truth. That's what we're about, seeking the truth. I think last year in Blount County, there were 329 cases of abuse made. We don't prosecute all those. All those are not prosecutable cases, but we will take the cases where we do seek the truth in determining whether or not an event happened. If we can support that evidence, then we will pursue those prosecutions.
Why do you like this life without the possibility for these type of crimes? Is it the recidivism rate? Is it the chances of rehabilitation? What do you feeling about that?
I don't think perping on a child is something you get over. I don't think you wake up and go, oh, I'm healed. I think that you can go into recovery for alcoholism. You can go into recovery for other types of drugs and be rehabilitated. I don't think you can rehabilitate a pedophile, and that puts every child they come into contact with at risk. And there's a reminder, because while I got you, you know, Christmas time is coming, and you're going to start buying phones and all these devices for your kids. If they're not in the home, the perpetrators we see, a lot of them, they're meeting perpetrators online. And you got to make sure that you're taking those steps to protect your kid. If you wouldn't open your front door and let a stranger walk in, go upstairs, and sit down in your daughter's bedroom, then you really should be taking those cell phones away from them at night, because they're meeting and talking to people. And it's always the parents that I hear say, I never would have thought my child would have communicated or been on that app. We have to take control of that before it takes over this generation. Thank you, guys.